Welcome to episode 2 of Deceptive Methods, a podcast about historical conspiracies. My name is Amanda, and I have a degree in history, which makes me qualified to speak on all history throughout the entire world. And
why, hello, I am Jesse. I'm Amanda's husband, and I have no clue what each subject is going to be on this podcast.
yes, the first episode, we didn't define the actual structure of the podcast, which is I am going to read a story about historical conspiracies to Jesse, and he doesn't know what the topic is going to be.
Yeah, I get to learn along with the audience.
Yes, it makes it hard for me
I am your proxy audience.
Yes, proxy audience. And it makes it hard for me to write the episodes because I like to talk about everything that I'm doing, and I can't talk about this.
I see you struggling a lot.
And I just sit there, I'm like, you're really going to like this?
Don't look at my screen. Don't look at this book, but you're going to like it.
All right, so let's get started. And I apologize in advance for mutilating all of these names. I'm going to try my best, but not really.
Whoa.
Okay. Sophie Frederica Augusta, Princess of Anhalt-Zerbst, Dornberg.
Okay.
She was a Prussian princess born in 1729 in the city of Stettin in the region of Pomerania.
Where the dogs are from.
Sounds like it. And sounds like it. And that is slightly northeast of Berlin today in modern day northwest Poland. So you get an idea of where this is.
Yeah.
So Sophie was born into the House of Anhalt, which was part of the princely families in Germany, made up of around 300 sovereign principalities in the Holy Roman Empire.
Oh, okay. I know a lot about those from playing Crusader Kings 3.
Yes, which we all know the Holy Roman Empire was not holy and not Roman.
Yes. Very much no to both.
Yes. And all of these sovereign principalities shared a common language, and that would be German.
Oh.
If you couldn't tell.
Yes.
Germany at this time was not a unified Germany, and that wouldn't happen until the 1800s, and many of the houses were very small and powerless.
That is the weird thing when you go through history as an American of Europe and how it all went and how we just see like Italy and all these other countries as, they must have always been that because we've always been America throughout our whole history. And like, nope, not even close.
Yeah, it changes so much. And it really wasn't even that big of a deal to be royalty because you could just be a prince of like a city or like a county. Okay, so as young as 8, Sophie traveled amongst these various noble houses with her mother, Joanna, the princess consort of Anhalt-Zerbst. I hope I'm saying that right.
Zerbst.
I really tried. Zerbst. Hoping to find a suitable match for marriage for her daughter. Sophie was groomed by her mother to become the wife of a ruler who was wealthy and powerful, which was the goal for every 8-year-old child.
Mm-hmm. I married off my 8-year-old in Crusader Kings to a 72-year-old so that I could get his army.
You shouldn't be saying that.
It's a video game. It happened.
All right.
It's on the internet.
Even though she was a princess, the family didn't have a lot of money. On her mother's side, she was closely connected to royalty in Sweden and Denmark. Her uncle and 2 of her first cousins did end up being kings of Sweden. So if you were wondering, that's Adolf Frederick was the uncle, Gustav III, and Charles XIII were the cousins. It's all very confusing. I admit I spent some time trying to at least get a grasp of all of this family tree, and it's impossible, if you're wondering.
I was wondering.
There were plenty of German royals to go around at this time, if you couldn't tell.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll find them all over Europe. England even imported one in 1714, who was George the First.
Mm-hmm.
He was the closest Protestant relative to Queen Anne after she died. So they were like, hey, dude, you want to come be king over here? Because we don't have anybody else who's not Protestant.
Not inbred enough.
Yeah.
Oh, they probably had that.
Sophie's mother, Joanna, was abusive to her. She was extremely disappointed she did not have a son.
Yeesh.
She called Sophie ugly and useless. And you can probably assume a lot worse than that happened.
Man.
Sophie wrote of her own childhood that, quote, I see nothing of interest in it, end quote.
Okay.
I did read that she was considered a tomboy, which had a lot more connotation back then than it does now. And she taught herself to use a sword.
Whoa.
In 1739, when she was 10, she met her second cousin and future husband, Charles Peter Ulrich of Holstein-Gottorp,
Sounds good to me.
who was the grandson of Peter the Great of Russia and niece of the current Empress of Russia, Elizabeth. It's like the longer your name is, the more important you are.
Yeah, and they all like using the same names over and over and over again.
There wasn't much variability in names.
No.
His mother was Peter the Great's daughter, Anna Petrovna, and she married a German prince. At the time, Peter was orphaned, and his guardian was Prince Bishop, whatever that means,
Okay.
Adolf Frederick, who was Joanna's brother. I tried to figure out what a Prince Bishop was, and then I actually got bored, and I was like, meh. This would be a huge step up for Sophie and her family, obviously. Since there were so many royal houses in Germany, the environment was highly competitive, and families would marry for political advantage as they fought for power over each other. So, what else is new?
Yeah. History.
AKA history.
Mm-hmm.
She wrote retrospectively that Charles was pale, thin, and delicate, and his attendants wanted him to appear as a mature man, which he couldn't pull off.
Aw.
So it was
He
like...
was a manlet.
Yeah, he looked dumb, and they were trying for him not to look dumb, but he couldn't
He
help
couldn't
it.
pull it off.
Yeah, he was trying, but it probably
That's
made it
sad.
worse.
Well, if he's a decent guy, it's sad. If he's an asshole, then tough shit.
Moving on. When she was 14, her mother used her connections to get an invitation to the Russian court. The Empress Elizabeth was so impressed by Sophie's looks and energy that she considered Sophie as the match to her chosen heir, the German Prince Peter, who is Charles. Charles Peter, but now he's Peter.
Chucky Pete.
Joanna spent loads of money to prepare to go to Moscow. However, this money was spent on her rather than her daughter. Which you would think the daughter is the one they're trying to marry off, not yourself. But
yeah, but when you're a selfish prick.
yeah, she was a narcissist. Peter wasn't a Russian prince, and he wasn't in the line of succession for the throne of Russia. So how did he end up becoming an heir and then emperor?
How?
Well, Elizabeth of Russia became empress herself via a military coup. She was the daughter of Peter the Great and had lots of support for her reign because the regency for the emperor at the time, the infant Ivan VI, was marked with high taxation and economic failure.
They blamed it all on a baby?
Yeah, it's his mother's fault.
Oh. Well, what if he was a really good baby king?
I don't think that's ever happened.
They didn't allow it this time, did they? Did a damn military
I know,
coup.
they stopped it. The French ambassador at the time bribed officers in the Imperial Guard to support Elizabeth's coup. She wore a metal breastplate over her dress, stormed the Winter Palace, and had the infant Ivan VI and his regent mother, his father, and their lieutenant colonel arrested, and then Elizabeth became the empress without bloodshed. She's just like, mine, bitches. She just put on a breastplate and said, this is mine now.
It worked.
But Elizabeth wasn't married and didn't have an heir, so she imported her nephew, Peter of Holstein-Gottorp, from Prussia to become the Romanov dynasty's heir. Which is really, when I was looking into this, it was very strange because at the same time, he was also proclaimed heir to Finland and Sweden.
Jesus.
Because of complex military politics that are really difficult to understand without a gigantic chart and a great memory.
Okay. He was the hot thing. He was the in style that summer.
But that was eventually voided because he was already the heir presumptive for Russia. So he can't be king of 3 countries.
I mean, you could.
No.
Again, they just don't want you to be.
That would cause a lot of wars, probably.
I mean, but then you've got 4 armies to fight for you.
Nah, it doesn't work that way because they won't want to.
Jerks.
So Peter was brought to St. Petersburg, received into the Russian Orthodox Church, and then declared the heir on November 7th, 1742.
Sure. Works for me.
The Empress Elizabeth had been betrothed to Sophie's uncle, which was her mother Joanna's brother, but he died right before they got married. And even though she despised her once potential sister-in-law, as it seems so many people did, she was actually eventually banned from St. Petersburg for spying on and interceding for the King of Prussia. So Joanna was like, she was out. So Elizabeth chose Sophie, who she had grown quite attached to. Sophie became her protege after she arrived officially in 1744. Sophie dedicated herself to learning Russian, and she wanted to do whatever it took to endear herself to the Empress and to the Russian people. When she first arrived, she almost died from pleuritis, which is inflammation of lung membranes.
Wow.
And at one point, her mother wanted her to be confessed by a Lutheran pastor, to which Sophie declared, "I want my Orthodox father." Sure. The Empress loved that.
Yeah. She seems to know how to play the game a lot better than her mom.
Yes. On June 28, 1744, Sophie was received herself into the Russian Orthodox Church, and her name was changed to Catherine, which is Ekaterina in Russian, in case you didn't know.
Anna Karenina.
And she was given the fake patronym of Alexeyevna, which is daughter of Alexei.
Sure.
Who was Alexei, though?
I
looked to try and make sure that Alexei didn't actually mean something about her father, but her father's name was Christian August.
I mean, that's very close to Alexei. So.
Yeah, and the Romanized version is Alexis, so...
Mm-hmm.
She was formally betrothed to Peter, and they were married on August 21st in 1745 when she was 16. And they were sent to Oranienbaum, which is a palace west of St. Petersburg, and they ruled Peter's home duchy of Holstein-Gottorp for experience to govern all of Russia.
Sure. I know what duchies are because of Crusader Kings 3.
And Holstein-Gottorp is in present-day northwest Germany on the border of Denmark.
Holstein-Gottorp.
Holstein. And Holstein-Gottorp was barely a kingdom and less than 1/3 the size of a current German state. And compared to the largest country on Earth.
Like little training wheels.
Yeah. So it seems like the experience would be quite similar.
Yes.
The marriage was unsuccessful, to put it lightly.
No.
It wasn't even consummated for years, which it seems like a common problem in Europe at this time, even despite the old tradition of witnessing the consummation. But sometimes it turned out that either one or both of the parties didn't even know what to do, or they were just put to bed and then everybody left. Like most of the time it wasn't them actually watching them have sex. I mean, I think sometimes it was, but it wasn't all the time. And contemporaries Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI also didn't consummate their marriage for years either. That was well known. And famously, I think, Catherine of Aragon and Henry VII's brother Arthur never consummated either. That was how Catherine became married to Henry VIII. Or I said Henry VII, but it was Henry VIII. That's how she became married to Henry VIII, because she said, I never had sex with him, so I'm still a virgin, so you can marry me now.
Yeah. You know, the ridiculous law is that a guy can bang, but if a lady bangs, she doesn't get to. Yeah.
Catherine and Peter were complete opposites. Catherine loved reading and educating herself, particularly engaging with Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot, and many of whom she kept up correspondence with over the years because they liked her as well.
And, you know, doesn't hurt to have a super wealthy, famous friend at that time. It's not like you make a lot of money as an artist.
Yeah. Peter, on the other hand, hated traditional learning. Peter was highly immature, bordering on ridiculously immature. He was entitled, self-centered. He was a brutal, practical joker. He was obsessed with military pageantry, and he hated Russians.
So he is everything that we see in movies about bad rulers that seem way over the top and way too much to have actually existed, but then you read history and see that they're just copying what real morons have been.
Yeah, they're like somebody couldn't possibly be like this, but they are. He would wake male servants up in the morning for drills, and his temperament became unbearable to the palace. He loved to play with toy soldiers and set up elaborate battles in his room. He also was an alcoholic and treated people like shit when he was drunk.
I mean, I believe it.
He also admired the Prussian king, who was Elizabeth's foe, so much that it bordered on obsessive. He was like a fanboy.
Mm-hmm.
It makes me wonder, like, why she insisted on this kid to be king. It was like, what are you seeing in this kid? I thought maybe it was like a sunk cost fallacy. Like she'd already
put
all this work into it. She couldn't just be like, never mind. And in 1911, the Encyclopedia Britannica said of Peter that nature had made him mean, the smallpox had made him hideous, and his degraded habits made him loathsome. And Peter had all the sentiments of the worst kind of a small German prince of the time. He had the conviction that his princeship entitled him to disregard decency and the feelings of others. He planned brutal practical jokes in which blows always had a share. His most manly taste did not rise above the kind of military interest which has been defined as corporal's mania.
Jesus Christ.
The passion for uniforms, pipeclay, buttons, the tricks of parade, and the froth of discipline. He detested the Russians and surrounded himself with Holsteiners.
Really sounds like a Trump.
He does.
Mm-hmm.
Peter's historically known character is mostly based on Catherine's writings and memoirs, and she hated him. And according to Catherine, Peter was an idiot, a drunkard from Holstein, and good for nothing. And this is what's mainly known about him in basically all the history we have, which...
So we get her biased take
right, but
on
I
it,
don't
but
think...
he did seem to really suck.
Yeah, I don't think anybody argued with it. I don't know. I think that there wasn't that many contemporary accounts, but like official ones, but he really was like this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She wasn't making it up.
No. I'm sure like he probably had a lot of qualities, bad and good, like most people. But he also had a pretty horrible childhood. He was orphaned young. He was abused physically and emotionally by his tutor, including being publicly flogged and forced to wear a picture of a donkey around his neck while at dinner. And he was exposed young to alcohol. And as we know, he also had the pox scars, which led him to become hideous. So he was an abused person who became an abuser. But childhood isn't an excuse for the way you behave as an adult.
You can understand why someone might turn out shitty, but it doesn't make it okay. But they
Right. I don't think people were as therapied and self-aware,
No.
but an asshole is still an asshole.
Mm-hmm.
And he also remained a Lutheran, which, yikes.
Oh, no.
And that really estranged a lot of people in the palace.
Mm-hmm.
Peter did end up taking a mistress, and Catherine took the time to read, and read a lot. As we know, she read Voltaire and other French Enlightenment philosophers.
And at the time, they'd probably be like, you're cheating on your husband with Voltaire.
She was flying him in at night, and then he was doing the walk of shame the next day.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe. Her mind was blown. And as she said it was a revolution in her mind when she read Tacitus's Annals. And he wrote about power politics practically rather than symbolically, and that people do not act according to their ideals. So this taught her to always look for the motives of anyone around her.
Ooh. Turned her into so he was the original Q.
She also took the time her husband was distracted by other women to finding her own partner, and she lost her virginity to Sergei Saltykov. Sergei was a chamberlain to the young court of the Grand Duke and Duchess. The Grand Duke and Duchess were Sophie and Peter.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many titles.
Yeah.
And a chamberlain is a senior royal official in charge of managing a royal household.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes
banging the royal mistress.
Banging the royal household.
Mm-hmm.
I think like sometimes I was interested to find out that a lot of royals actually did work in the house. Like they had titles that meant they were working. Like he was quote unquote the manager, but he probably wasn't doing much managing. It was just a title.
Yeah.
Sergei was from the Saltykov family, which was one of the oldest and noblest in Russia. Catherine wrote that he was handsome as a god. Ooh. But he was really neither as handsome or as intelligent as Catherine thought he was. But he was charming, and he had a habit of breaking hearts and taking virtue from the ladies around him. And he took advantage of Peter's neglect of Catherine and approached her.
Mm-hmm.
He professed his love and chased her around for quite a while, but neither were really concerned about Peter at all.
Yeah, I mean, he's too childish. He probably didn't even... He could catch them banging and have no idea what's going on.
Yeah. Eventually, they succumbed.
Are you playing war?
Are you wrestling? Eventually, they succumbed, and she was 23 and had been in an unconsummated marriage for 8 years.
Jesus.
That's a long time. Even if he did know, Peter really wasn't concerned with what he thought was a flirtation. But I think he knew it was more, from what I gathered. Like, he knew. Like, he probably was like, oh, it's just a flirtation. But he knew. Sergei and Catherine were concerned that if she became pregnant, everyone would know it wasn't Peter's kid because Peter himself was still well known to be a virgin. So even though he had a quote-unquote mistress, he wasn't actually doing anything.
They played together, but it was just playing with toy soldiers.
Yes. They played in bed, but it was with soldiers. Toy soldiers.
Mm-hmm. Not penises.
Yeah, and so even though he had mistresses, he didn't seem to have relations with anyone. So Sergei conspired to get Peter to start sleeping with his own wife. He convinced Peter to have an operation to remove the barrier for him to be able to have sex. Maybe if you really dug deep, you could find out what that means, but exactly what it means, but it sounded like he couldn't get it to do a poke. The morning after the consummation, Peter sent the Empress Elizabeth a casket with proof of the virginity of Catherine. The court laughed privately behind his back, but congratulated him to his face. He was like, I conquered.
God.
And by the way, have you realized who this is yet? Have you realized who this is yet?
No.
I figured that you might, you probably know nothing about this era.
Nope.
At all. This is Catherine the Great.
Oh, okay.
It's not really a huge reveal. I thought maybe you would pick up along the way, but
I thought maybe, but then I forgot.
Then I immediately forgot.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's continue. This was a huge relief because Catherine was already pregnant.
Oh.
But she miscarried the baby, sadly.
Aww.
And Sergei was already becoming cold to her.
Jeez.
And she miscarried again in the next year, 1753. The Empress was actually disappointed because she was hoping this would bring forth a much-needed heir, even if it wasn't Peter's child.
Yeah. What if it was the horse's child? I'm kidding. I know it's not real.
That was something I was going to post a picture of. I posted a picture of her. I was going to say, don't at me about horses.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not even talking about it. But Elizabeth was also not letting Sergei leave until he fulfilled his duty to get Catherine pregnant since Peter couldn't.
So is this the Great show? Peter is the moron husband she has in that show?
I mean, I think that...
The way you were describing him and when I've seen you watching that show, that sounds exactly like that idiot.
It's not really off. I mean, he was really like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, Nicholas Holt.
Yeah. And Peter really didn't care at all. He hated Catherine so much that he didn't care his aunt was trying to get Catherine pregnant by another man, one that she already had a public affair with. I'm sure he was also constantly berated by his aunt for failing to perform to her standards. She seems like a taskmaster.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of like, if she likes you, she loves you, and if she hates you, you're never getting off the shit list. Which actually, Catherine did get off the shit list, but that's a whole nother thing. I decided not even go into that. But she got on the shit list and managed to get herself out.
That's why she was called so great.
She was pretty great at manipulating. Elizabeth made their life miserable for not producing an heir. So she got off the shit list for not producing an heir, and then also for conspiring. But like, can you imagine like basically having a lurking mother-in-law like making you miserable for not having a baby?
No, thankfully.
Or that happening for 8 years because it took 8 years for them to actually sleep together?
How about a angry father-in-law if you even think of making a baby?
Right. And like as a royal young couple, their only job was to have babies. Like you and I, we've been together for 11 years, but imagine 8 years of having a mother-in-law being like, why are you not pregnant?
No, thank you.
Yeah, no. So like this was the environment. This was the vibe of the court. Sounds like a really cool vibe. During this time, Peter became even more petulant, disappearing more and more into childish behavior. One day, Catherine walked into Peter's room and saw a dead rat strung up and mutilated.
What the hell?
He said this was performed with all the formality of an execution. And when Catherine asked why, he said the rat was guilty by military law for eating through 2 soldiers stuffed with starch. And the rat would be hung up for 3 days to serve as an example.
He's, there's something off with that man.
Yeah, it's like you can't even make it up.
No.
You're like, oh, I see you watching this show and it seems really true. Peter was also drinking a lot, not just wine, but also liquor. And remember from the dollop that liquor was kind of like a fresh thing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it became popular. It probably had been around because I think it said that he had like Ukrainian servants bring him the liquor. And he would drink with servants and then end up beating them for forgetting their respect towards him.
Okay.
It's like they're all drinking together, and as soon as they loosen up, he beats them.
He's a real winner.
Yeah, and I've heard like a couple modern historians are trying to be like, well, maybe he wasn't as bad, and I'm like, I really don't think so. I really think he was that bad.
Mm-hmm.
In 1754, Catherine finally gave birth after 9 years of marriage, and the Empress immediately snatched the baby away and kept him in her apartments. Because remember, she'd never had children.
Yeah.
So she wanted an heir, and she wanted her own baby.
Right away.
Yes. And Catherine was left alone in her own blood for hours. She could barely move, and she was completely neglected now that the baby was born.
Aww.
Like she was literally completely alone.
She was just
like,
a broodmare the moment that baby was born.
Nobody came in to even check on her for hours. And Catherine didn't see her son Paul for 40 days. And even then, she was only allowed to see him from a distance. And Sergei was sent to Hamburg, and she saw him once before he left, and then never again. And this could have been the end of Catherine's story if she was another woman, but she was great. And Catherine decided that she would not let herself suffer because of any man. And when she reappeared at court, she had a magnificent dress made and was determined not to let anyone see her humiliated. And she restyled herself the mother of the heir.
Oh.
She was like making herself important. And she snubbed those who had ignored her after the birth. And she wittily rebuked anyone who stood up to her. And she became colder, sharper, and more perceptive.
Mm-hmm. And she really got a thing for horses.
Dang it, I was hoping we could get through without that. And this only made Peter hate her more. He would confront her and remove half his sword from his sheath and threaten her, but she only laughed at him. He was desperate for his court to take him seriously, but they never did. He dove into playing at military life and ordered a contingent of soldiers from Holstein to come over to Oranienbaum. And people there were really pissed because the soldiers were from Prussia and Russia was at war with Prussia at the time. They were considered traitors, and he was bringing them right into their home. He was alienating the Russian soldiers, and servants hated serving the soldiers. Mm-hmm. They probably all treat each other like shit too. Yeah. The Holsteiners were probably like, I'm better than you. And then the Russians were like, fuck you. And Peter even went to live with, quote unquote, his troops. And Catherine made it known that she did not approve at all.
He is, like, people will look in the past and think, wow, how could someone as dumb as Trump ever become president? And you look in history and it's normal.
History repeats itself.
Yeah.
Things like this. When people say history repeats itself, they just mean like assholes come to power. Just little things like
and
this.
Then
It
if
doesn't.
you get a period where there's not an asshole or an idiot in power, and you forget about it. It just takes enough time where the collective consciousness forgets how unbelievably stupid
Right.
many rulers are.
And if we think Trump is bad, there are presidents in American history who are just as bad.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he's not even an anomaly. In 1758, Catherine was pregnant again, and the rumors were that the father was Stanislaus Poniatowski.
Whoa.
And he would eventually become the king of Poland.
Oh, there you go.
There were rumors that Peter was thinking about denying paternity, but in the end, he didn't. It might have been possible he was the father, but we don't know for sure. When Catherine went into labor, Peter arrived in full Holstein uniform and proclaimed he was there to protect Catherine from her enemies. He probably was drunk. I mean, it seemed every time they're like, and Peter came into the room, and he was drunk. And once again, the baby, who was a daughter, was taken from Catherine, and she was named Anna after the Empress's sister, who was Peter's mother, if you remember.
Yeah.
Catherine suggested to name her Elizabeth, but the Empress wasn't moved. She was like, nah, fuck that.
I'll name my baby what I want to name my baby.
It's my baby. Stanislaus was expelled from Russia, and Anna died when she was still a baby, sadly. But it seemed Catherine didn't... I don't know if she didn't allow herself to care about her children, but she never expresses any love about her children, probably because maybe they were just taken away and she just steeled herself against that, or
the moment they're born, what did you want to do? You want to hold them, and if you never get to do that,
you don't form a bond. But a lot of women who stuff like that happens to, they just don't ever get over it. But she steeled herself and she got over it. During her baby-making years in the late 1750s, Catherine had a lot of time to think about her future in the court. She knew that when Peter ascended the throne, she would have a very minor role in the politics, which she was never going to let that happen.
Yeah.
So she's plotting. She became close to the British ambassador and accepted bribes for information. She used the bribes to purchase a network of informants. She also started an actual courtship with people in power. So she started mingling.
She was doing some social networking.
So social. and here is where the story really gets interesting. Ooh. Here's where we get into the conspiracy.
Okay, good. It's been terrible. So, I mean, it's been great.
It's been really boring. As history is. History is always boring.
Mm-hmm. The worst.
Catherine is now 30, and Empress Elizabeth is near death.
Yay!
Woo! Catherine became really close to 5 brothers, all of whom were soldiers, and she took one for a lover, which was Grigory Orlov.
Grigory Orlov.
Grigory Orlov. I shouldn't have done that.
Too late.
He was a formidable and handsome man, but not so much intelligent. But he was devoted to Catherine, as were all the brothers.
Aww.
I'm not going to name them all because this is just too many names. So it's Grigory is the main one. He's the banger. And then there was a smart one named Alexis. But we'll get to that in a second. So all the soldiers worked on propaganda for her from inside the military. They were inspired by her devotion to Russia and the Orthodox Church, which I really don't think I think she really wanted to be Russian. She wasn't pretending. I didn't really add this in here, but it might help to mention how at the time Russia was really exotic. It wasn't Europeanized. It was still to Europeans an exotic place. So it was interesting and new and fresh and all these things that she didn't know, and she really liked it. So she really wanted to be Russian, and she wasn't faking it. And it was the third brother who was the most devoted. His name was Alexis, and he was a specimen, as well as smart and ambitious. So he was a Slytherin.
Ah, got it.
He was nicknamed Scarface, and he could knock out an ox with one punch.
Jesus. That's impressive and also horrifying.
Yeah. It sounds like you. You could probably...
I never would.
You could probably punch a cow in the face and knock it out.
I mean, I probably don't have. I would probably break my hand. I doubt I would use my hands as much as him, but yeah, maybe.
I think you could. She also became close with the Tsarevich Paul's tutor, Nikita Panyin. They both had similar political views, and they both knew that Peter could not succeed to the throne. And they both disagreed with Peter's Prussian loyalty. But Panyin wanted the child, Paul, to become emperor, while Catherine had her own eye on the throne. And she was like, yeah, Paul.
Yeah, sure.
That's what we're going to do.
Who's Paul again?
It's funny, like, she had to be close to the tutor because she couldn't be close to the child.
Yeah.
And later in life, she actually hated her son because he was a lot like Peter. He grew up to be a lot like Peter because he was raised by that faction.
Yep.
So she really didn't like him.
My thoughts don't stink, Mummy.
If he even was allowed to talk to her. Peter's faction, on the other hand, planned to have Peter ascend, immediately divorce Catherine, and have Paul declared illegitimate. And then he would end the war with Prussia. Peter also made no effort to keep these plans hidden. Such a douche. He proclaimed that when he became emperor, he would shave Catherine bald and send her to a convent. And they were both waiting for the Empress to die to strike. Must have been tense. Catherine also welcomed Ivan Shuvalov's, the Empress's current favorite. She accepted his desperate courting.
Oh.
Because he knew she was going to die, and he's like, I need a mummy. I need a dummy mummy, as I've heard them say. He knew that she would become at least the regent, if not the empress. She was amused by his blatant flattery and saw right through him, of course. She thought it would be a good idea to also have him as an ally. She needed somebody so desperate. She also gained another unlikely ally, the sister of Peter's former mistress. Her name was Princess Catherine Dashkova, so they're both Catherines. And she was 17. She greatly admired Catherine, even though her family actively hated her. Catherine appreciated conversation with Jaskova because Grigory was not able to keep up at Catherine's level. So she's like, finally, someone I can
I've
talk
got this
to.
rebellious, smart teen. I'm in.
Yeah, she's like me. When the Empress was close to death, the princess rode to Catherine's court with a cold. She had a cold. And so she rode over there while she was sick and begged Catherine to tell her what to do and asked her what the plan was. Catherine replied that she had no plan except to accept the events as they unfolded, which doesn't sound like her. No one knew that she was currently 5 months pregnant with Grigory's child. She knew that if Peter found out, he would use her condition to renounce her and her claims. So now she was like, fuck. Nobody can know I'm pregnant. So it's like lots of tension. Like, yikes. I mean, everyone was plotting. Everyone was speculating. So they're all just like waiting around for her to die. And nobody knew what was going to happen. It was like they were just waiting for this big clash to happen. You know, was Peter going to succeed to the throne? Or would it be Catherine? Would she usurp the throne like Elizabeth had herself? And when Elizabeth died on Christmas Day, 1761, which is actually January 5th, 1762 in the Gregorian calendar, if you want to get into that.
I don't.
Well, in North America, we lost 11 days when the Julian calendar switched to our current Gregorian, and that was in September of 1752, so a lot of dates around this time were like, but it was actually 11 days earlier. And Russia didn't switch to the Gregorian calendar until 1918.
Jesus.
So everything is always like 11 days behind. But anyway, when she died, Peter III was declared king. Of course. I mean, that has to happen first.
Yep.
And Peter proceeded to be a complete dick.
I am shocked.
He didn't even pretend he didn't hate the Empress and how happy he was that she was dead. It was custom for her to remain in the court for 6 weeks and then 10 days at the cathedral. He refused to stand vigil over his aunt's body. He talked loudly, joked, made faces, and mocked the priest during the funeral. During the funeral procession, he made an ass out of himself even more by running around the coffin, forcing the dignitaries who were bearing the train to let go. Then he would stop dead, making them just like stop and
Yeah.
follow him. And should we repeat?
No.
Okay. He laughed and talked and interrupted the priest during the service. He even ended the period of mourning really early.
Because he sounds like a massive case of ADHD.
Yeah. And Catherine, on the other hand, was perfectly performing her duties and was extra pious.
Yep, she knows how to play the game, and he doesn't even know the game exists.
Yeah, he doesn't even know it's there. The next night, he ordered the entire army to cease fire and return to Russia, ending Russia's involvement in the 7 Years' War, which is a big move.
Yeah.
That's a big move. That's a big dumb move. He wrote to King Frederick of Prussia that he was his friend and ally. He returned all land to Prussia. Then he ordered the army to join the Prussians to fight the Austrians.
God.
Now the Russian army had to join the side they were just fighting against. He was just such an idiot. Like, did he really think people were going to love him for doing this? Or did he even care that people,
No,
like...
he didn't think, and he didn't care.
I think he was, like, so entitled that he's not, you know...
I'm king now, you do what I say.
Yeah, like, did he really think people would just let him do, like, literally whatever the fuck he wanted and just stand by?
Well, he probably bought into the whole I'm set by God and you can't dare question me.
He probably should have done some traditional learning and learned some history.
No, not fun enough.
You know, like I said earlier, some historians say he wasn't as dumb as Catherine and the contemporaries made him look, but I'm not
His
sure.
actions made him sure sound very,
Yeah.
very dumb.
I'm not sure. He dressed the Russian troops in Prussian uniforms, ordered them to do Prussian drills, replaced bodyguards with Holstein bodyguards, and then made Prince George Holstein the commander of the Russian armies and also the elite unit that had always been under the command of the sovereign.
So that pretty much just is saying, hey, Russia, I'm turning you into Prussia Junior because I'm a little baby back bitch to my, you know.
Yes.
Yes. I'm sure they love that.
Yeah. He also had cannons fired constantly, day and night, so he could pretend he was in the middle of warfare. Oh, man. He then tried to practically dismantle the Orthodox Church and seize all their wealth. And he gave Orthodox property to Lutheran ministers. So that's the final straw.
Yeah, that seems real dumb.
But in a little bit of his defense, he wasn't completely useless. Like, he did have some progressive reforms. Because of the whole Orthodox Church thing, he did proclaim religious freedom, and he did encourage education, even though he didn't take part. And he sought to modernize the Russian army because they were a little bit behind, but he was forcing it by having them try to be Prussian. And he abolished the secret police, which had been infamous for its extreme violence, and made it illegal for landowners to kill their serfs without going to court.
Oh.
This was probably more like people doing this for him rather than...
Yeah, a bunch of people like, hey, we got some good ideas that Elizabeth didn't give a shit about. You're so handsome and smart. People would love it if you would do these things.
Yeah.
No, would they? Them signed off. Go.
Yeah.
Where's my toy?
Yeah. Peter was increasingly humiliating Catherine in court. He tried to get her to admit publicly that their son Paul was illegitimate. He forced her to give up her insignia of Saint Catherine, which is bestowed to the tsarinas and wives of heirs, to his mistress. And he openly expressed that he wanted his mistress to become Empress.
Okay.
Yeah. So Catherine was still hiding her pregnancy from everyone but her closest friends. She was banished to the new Winter Palace, which was great for her because she could hide away until she gave birth secretly and continue on with her plans. So he's like, you must go. And she's like, okay.
All right, I'll have this kid. I don't give a shit about him, and then I'll come back.
Yeah. The plan for when she went into labor was for her valet, I don't never know if it's valet or valet. I've heard of both. Her valet to set fire to his own house because Peter loved fire and would go and watch it. Would go and watch it with his courtiers. And as soon as the baby was born, he was swaddled and immediately sent to a relative. And the valet set his house on fire, and Peter and his mistress rushed over to watch. So.
Oh, man.
Catherine realized the immediate danger she was in when Peter ordered her to be imprisoned when she refused to stand for a toast to the, quote, imperial family,
Jesus.
which was his Holstein family.
Mm-hmm.
His uncle talked him out of it because it would arouse the army and noble families.
Stupid ass nephew, don't do that, or else everyone who likes her and hates you is going to get really pissed.
And he probably still didn't understand, but he probably just listened to Daddy Uncle.
Okay, Uncle Daddy, I do whatever you want.
That was when Catherine and her faction knew that Peter was intent on eliminating her, and they had to start considering a plan for a revolution. Start considering a palace revolution.
Ooh.
And a plan.
Plan for a palace-y revolution of plenitude in Prussia.
Prosperity.
Prussia Junior.
Her friends in high places immediately set to work to recruit as much of the local army as they could. They didn't think they had enough, so she asked for a loan from Louis XV's ambassador, who was uncomfortable and felt that the pillars of the conspiracy to be weak reeds and that he had no faith in the plot. So she ended up securing a loan from an English merchant. Peter ordered Catherine to move from St. Petersburg to Peterhof, while he traveled to collect troops to drill and prepare to send them to Denmark to aid Holstein. I started calling her faction the Cathfac. Should we call it that?
Sure.
The Cathfac suspected this was a trap, but Catherine left anyway. She didn't go directly where he wanted, but she went to a summer house nearby.
Mm-hmm.
Peter sent word he'd be there in 10 days for his birthday, where the faction thought Peter planned to humiliate her even more. The kick in the ass happened when one of their faction was arrested after insulting the Tsar while drunk 2 days before Peter was supposed to arrive, and so they knew he would say more under torture. So they're like, we got to go now.
Mm-hmm.
An Orlov brother ran to the president of the Academy of Sciences, who was a supporter of Catherine. They used the Academy's printer to print up a manifesto that Peter III had abdicated and Catherine II was now the Empress. Then he went to Catherine to tell her what he'd done. Nothing else had happened at this point. Nothing with the military, nothing. It was just this manifesto.
And then they posted it on the internet, which made it law.
Yes.
Galactic
law.
It
was the 1760s version of the internet, a manifesto. And that was Alexis that did that. He was the Slytherin, remember? So he was taking action.
The hottie who was also kind of naughty.
He arrived, and he and Catherine immediately fled with her maid, valet, her French coiffeur, of course, and lieutenant. They arrived at the barracks for one of their regiments, which were excited and ready. They had been promised vodka. Along the way to the Cathedral of Kazan, they collected more regiments besides the one that they had, which hadn't been infiltrated yet. The regiment fell quickly when a chief took up the battle cry and the officers were arrested. She entered the cathedral and was accepted by the clergy. So she had permission of the church.
Yep.
The archbishop received her as the sovereign and gave his blessing to her and her son. She then marched on to the Winter Palace. The 6 regiments and all the artillery were gathered in the quay in front of the palace. Catherine entered the palace and went right to Panyon and demanded her son. Then she appeared with him in a window. Appearing in the window is, we still do that.
Yes.
UK still does that. They still appear in the window.
Yep. Booze.
She opened the doors to the palace for everyone to approach her as the Empress. She sat for hours as she received all manner of people who prostrated in front of her. Clergy, merchants, high officials, dignitaries, ambassadors, senators, etc.
No poor people, though.
They were probably hanging around trying to get in there. It sounded like it was just a big party. And I think eventually she had to send people out to be like, don't let them party too much because we don't want this to be a riot.
Red wedding.
Yeah. The manifesto was passed to everyone outside to read. The manifesto proclaimed that Russia had been endangered by the course of recent events.
By handing everything over to Prussia.
They handed out the internet.
Yeah.
The plan was to keep news of the coup from Peter as long as possible. Nothing had been set in stone yet. Peter still had the troops he gathered in preparation for Denmark. He was still in the dark when he arrived at Peterhof for his birthday. The house was closed and calm. An officer told him that Catherine had fled at dawn, but Peter didn't believe him. He ran through the empty house looking for Catherine and yelling for her, instead of immediately marching to St. Petersburg as his chancellor suggested. Instead, he ran around, as we said. He fainted, drank large amounts of Burgundy, dictated a list of people to be arrested for conspiracy, drafted and printed 2 manifestos against Catherine. But he was just like running around like, I don't know what to do.
Mommy!
But he didn't listen to the people who are like, you need to go there.
Yeah.
And instead he just ran around and
His
fainted.
entire history of not listening to people around him, yeah.
Eventually, he boarded a schooner and traveled to a garrison, which I think it was like an island. An island.
Yeah.
Just went to a garrison on an
He
island.
wanted to really, he wanted to set himself up to be completely boxed in.
Yeah. When they approached the fortress, they announced the emperor, and the officer called back that there is no longer an emperor and to leave immediately. Instead, Peter disembarked, thinking the garrison and the soldiers would submit to him, but they didn't. He cried and sobbed. And then even one of his own counts, named Munich, laughed at him and called him back aboard. They went back to the palace at Oranienbaum. That was where Catherine was supposed to be, but she didn't exactly go there. And Munich urged him to march to where the troops for Denmark were gathered. And he went inside and slept instead. Because this was all happening in one day.
Yeah.
This was...
And he was just emotionally exhausted after his big, strong cry.
Yeah. During this, Catherine had put on a man's uniform, donned a sword,
Whoa.
and left to, quote, bring peace and security to the throne, end quote.
And carrying a horse on her back. To show how strong she was. What?
Many of the soldiers had dug out their Russian uniforms and stripped off the German ones. They headed toward Peterhof. Along the way, an emissary approached Catherine with a note from Peter with an offer to share power. And Catherine laughed. They arrived at Peterhof, where Peter had all but surrendered. The scraps of his soldiers had been stripped. Not a drop of blood was spilt.
Just like her formerly liked her pseudo auntie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Catherine drafted the writ of abdication for Peter to sign, and I'm going to quote this. During the brief period of my absolute rule over the Empire of Russia, I have recognized that my strength was not sufficient to bear such a burden. For this reason, after mature reflection, I solemnly declare of my own free will to all Russia and to the entire universe that I renounce the government of the said empire for as long as I shall live.
I mean, yeah.
Strong words.
Yes. I'm a giant bitch.
To the universe.
Yes. I was not strong enough to rule for very long because I tried to hand the entire country over to my uncle who I really like.
Yeah, and then feelings weren't mutual.
No.
Peter was basically a prisoner at Oranienbaum. He signed the abdication like a child who is sent to bed. That was a quote from Frederick II. I kind of feel bad when his hero said that about him. Like, that was his hero. And then his hero's like, you were a dumbass child.
But he was also he was such a shithead that I also don't feel bad for him.
Yeah, but I always feel bad for people when they're at
you're
their
nice
lowest.
and
I
I'm
do.
not.
Like, I feel like it could be the villainiest villain, but once they're so humiliated to this level, I feel bad for them.
You feel bad for Hitler when he was putting the gun up to his head? Hmm?
He wasn't humiliated,
Oh, okay.
but I would not ever
Okay.
feel bad. No.
When he lost that painting tournament or whatever the hell it was?
No.
Okay.
I
see?
can't say. That's
See, I found one.
that's my limit. Yeah, I wouldn't. Okay, so he was taken to Peterhof and so that was Peter was taken to Peterhof. The Peterhof throws me off. He asked to see the Empress and was refused. He was stripped of his decorations and given the plebs' clothes.
They took all his toys away.
Yeah. Panion told him he was now a state prisoner and would be placed under surveillance. He was sent to another summer residence before ultimately he knew he would be sent to the fortress of Schlüsselburg, where the former Tsar Ivan, the baby one, was currently kept. He's still there.
He's still a little baby?
No.
No.
He's pretty old now.
Oh, man.
Catherine was received triumphantly in St. Petersburg.
St. Catherinesburg.
In July, she wrote another manifesto proclaiming her accession and the abdication of Peter, and she insisted on her intention to be worthy of the love of her people. Mm-hmm. Later that same day, she received a note from Alexis that said he begged her pardon and that Peter was dead.
Yep. That's it?
Yep. Well, I mean, it was a little bit more than that. Mm-hmm. He didn't even remember how it happened. One moment he was drunkenly fighting with someone during dinner, and then he was no more. I didn't even remember. So, like, Catherine knew it was a plot to assassinate him on her behalf. There's not really much evidence she even knew about this. She probably didn't want this to happen right away because it made her a little nervous.
Yeah.
She was frightened it would hurt her reputation. And then she issued a third manifesto that stated Peter died from a hemorrhoidal attack.
He had a butthole burst?
an apoplexy stroke and violent colic. But mainly it was the hemorrhoidal attack.
So he had really bad hemorrhoids that killed him?
Yep. His butthole exploded, I guess.
I mean, back then that probably was a real issue.
I'm sure it happened to someone. Yeah. And a Frenchman once joked that he would not visit Russia because hemorrhoids there are life-threatening. Nobody knows exactly how he died. The theories are poison wine, strangulation with a rifle, or suffocation under a mattress.
Jesus.
Many think that Alexis acted before Peter would be sent to Schlüsselburg, where he would no longer have access to him.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
And he also thought that by performing this favor, Catherine might be more inclined to marry his brother Gregory and give the brothers more favor in general. And despite her anxiety, there was no reaction from the people.
Yeah, everyone hated him so goddamn much that they didn't give a shit.
Yeah.
We like you! Someone died? Are you okay?
But we love you.
Oh, you're fine. Okay, yay!
On September 22nd, 1762, at the Assumption Cathedral in the Moscow Kremlin, Catherine was crowned. She brought Russia into full participation in the political and cultural life of Europe. With her ministers, she reorganized the administration and law of the Russian Empire and extended Russian territory, which is not always great, adding the Crimea and much of Poland, which is not great for everyone.
No, there have been a lot of fights about that even recently.
Yeah. She went on to become one of Russia's and the world's most powerful and greatest rulers of all time.
The end. And nothing ever else happened in that area of the world ever again that was bad.
Yeah. I kind of skipped over a part, so we'll go back. It's short.
Go for it.
After 6 months of rule, Peter was buried in a monastery in his Holstein uniform without decoration in an open casket, and Catherine did not attend the funeral.
I don't blame her.
And then on September 22nd, 1762, she was crowned.
Well, there you go. Yeah, I did not know most of that, though, after seeing you watch that show on, was it Hulu?
Yeah.
I get it. I get why
Nicholas
Holt's character is like that and everything so conspiracy-y and horny and dumb.
Catherine, and we all know that she didn't keep a secret about all her lovers and people which was a lot. But if you're a woman, you can't do that. So then you must die.
True. I mean, no.
You must die by the hoof of a animal we will not mention because I wasn't going to mention it. So, yeah, I mean, she was great in her ideals, and she did make Russia very progressive. But of course, like all rulers, she also did horrible things too. But I think she tried her best with what she had to do good, and she couldn't always do good because people would not like her if she wanted to do the actual good things. So, you know, and she also worried for her own butt on the throne. So
yeah, you can't
do
that time
you can't
in
become
history,
an Enlightenment ruler.
It's really only been until recently where but I mean, even then you get someone like, oh, Obama's great. Yeah, he also murdered how many thousands of innocent people with drone strikes that were aimed at others, and then oh, sorry, you're just collateral.
Yeah.
So yeah,
she wanted to rule under the ideals of the Enlightenment, but she pretty soon found out that wasn't going to be possible.
Yeah, you can't put. She, unlike Peter, knew she could only push it so far.
Yeah. So, that was the episode on Catherine the Great.
Wow, exactly 1 hour long.
And
we did it. And we will.
We'll see you next time in about a month. And
yes,
make sure that you like and subscribe and all that stuff. And
yep, we're up on Anchor and we're on the YouTubes, and you can find Amanda and I working over on the Xbox era at times, where most of you probably found us from.
Yeah, maybe. And we also have an Instagram where I try to post funny pictures, so go check that out.
What's the Instagram?
It's Deceptive Methods.
There you go. We are Deceptive Methods pretty much everywhere, including the Twitter too.
Yeah.
But all right, thank you everyone, and we will see you in roughly a month from when this went up.
Bye.
Bye.
The sources for this episode are Henri Troyat's Catherine the Great, published in 1994. If you enjoyed this episode, then I highly recommend this book because it's very entertaining, funny. Pretty much everything funny came from this book. YouTube channel Biographics, Catherine the Great, Russia's Greatest Empress. YouTube channel Exploring History, How Catherine the Great Came to Power. And Catherine the Great and the Coup That Made Her Empress on History.com. And Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia from Britannica.